What's up, guys and gals, and welcome back to another Division 2 build video. If you happen to be new to the channel or you're just enjoying the content, then be sure to ground and pound that like and subscribe button. And don't forget to reach up there, trigger the bell, and turn on post notifications, so that way you never miss a live stream or a video that is uploaded. Well, it's been asking me to kind of more or less do an updated version since there are a new influx of players, believe it or not, to Division 2, and are inquiring about doing heroic missions in the raid and the things of this nature. Basically all things PvE, something that's tangible that they can get, and that'll be very viable for, you know, a long time coming. So this is my updated Title Update 5 PvE raid build, whatever you want to call it. I just call it, you know, a complete monster. But anyways, let's hop right into it. First, we have the military M60E4, 39.8k base damage with unhinged, allegro, and in rhythm. And then, of course, in the mod slots, we have damage to elites with the EXPS3 hollow sight, the 5% rate of fire ammunition belt, the underbarrel is the 10% reload speed. In the 7.62 muzzle slot, we have an additional plus 5% damage to elites. Now, in the secondary is what you would get in the raid, either by another player dropping it for you, such as myself. Someone dropped it for me. I was very gracious in accepting it. But if you don't have it, then, you know, other LMGs, whether it be rate of fire or, you know, I don't necessarily recommend the stoner, even though it does have 200 rounds and you can put unhinged on it, just the damage is a little underwhelming. The pestilence, I mean, you could in certain parts of the raid, such as like the first part, going like into the airport, but it's not really that necessary, and I mean, it's not really that effective either. So, I mean, you can either go like how I got it, more or less with an AR as your secondary, or just whatever your best LMG, and then just whatever secondary you prefer. But mine is the M60, and then of course the Eagle Bearer, and it's not just more or less because of the damage it does, but it's more because of the holstered talent. And the holstered talent states protected fire. While holstered, gain, you can see it's not exactly the highest, because I have no Fenris piece on there, but I can easily substitute one in if I want to increase my damage by another 10%. Then it's easily switched out. It's just whatever you prefer. But still at 26.4k compared to other ARs, it still has the highest base damage, so that's why I go to for it. But that plus 10% armor while firing the 100 round LMG increases your survivability, and in turn, the more you stay up, then the more damage you can inflict on bosses and NPCs and things of this nature. That is why I am running the Eagle Bearer as my secondary. But like I stated, you know, if you don't have it, then basically any other secondary of your choice, it's whatever you prefer, as long as it's, you know, an LMG. Alright, now moving on more or less to the holster talent of your pistol. Once again, it's more or less personal preference, whatever you prefer, but I'm going more or less with rooted while equipped, and in cover, all skill damage and healing is increased by 25% for 10 seconds. But I mean, you can go with, I wouldn't say recharged. You can do this, just as far as the only thing it's going to affect is if you're using like a chem launcher, it'll more or less extend the duration of it if you're at full armor. So if you're in cover and, you know, want to pop a pistol at your feet while you're at full armor, get, you know, a plus 25% duration on it, so that way you can start taking shots at, you know, NPCs or whatever you need to lay down fire on, and it'll help out just a little bit, but it's not really that necessary. So let's hop into the build itself. Now, there are a couple of different ways that you can actually, you know, run this. If you want a more of a mixed and overall, I would say a 50-50 between weapon damage when it comes to the AR and LMG, then basically it just comes down to switching out some gloves, or you can just take off more or less the Petrov and just run a Heligard piece. It just depends on what type of backpack you have, and what I mean by what type of backpack is usually Petrov, well, in my experience anyways, has a lot of lackluster attributes on it. I've never gotten one that has weapon damage over 5%, and also if it does have, you know, weapon damage of say 5%, then it always has a super low armor roll. So if I had an absolute choice, then my second go-to would be more or less a Healer Guard backpack, because you can have the 10% weapon damage, and then also it'll have a offensive mod slot in which you can kind of substitute and gain additional armor, but yet you're going to lose having that one piece Petrov, and then a potential 10% weapon damage on it with a total of 20%, and the Petrov does not have a mod slot, so therefore your max is going to be around 20%. Well, if you go this route, counting a 6.5% offensive mod in the offensive slot of the Gila, plus the 10% weapon damage that's on it, then it comes to 16.5%. So yes, you're losing 3.5%, but if you see on the left-hand side of my screen, my armor value goes up 30,000. So that is a choice that you're going to have to make for yourself. But in my personal opinion, I think that 3.5% sacrificing of the weapon damage is okay, because you're gaining that significant amount of armor by way of 30k armor. Now, if it was just you're gaining 5,000 armor or 10,000 armor, then that was definitely be an argument to be made and wouldn't be necessarily worth it. But in this case, gaining that much armor, then it is very viable and a go-to to not run a Petrov piece, but actually use a Healer Guard backpack like you see on this screen, but instead of like hardened, you would probably want to go to damage to elites and then have a percentage armor value that's in the top attributes, but it's definitely still viable. And then that additional mod slot, you can have like I said, the weapon damage, and then it's got the defensive weapon, defensive mod slot that you can have 5,000 or 6,000 armor on it, and then a 3.5 to 4% armor total on it. So that would take place of the hardened talent. So if you removed hardened off of it, put hard hitting on it, the damage to elites, and then because of the defensive mod slot, then you're not more or less sacrificing that 10% armor, because you can actually gain it in that defensive mod slot versus a Petrov backpack that does not have any mod slots in it. So basically, whatever it has, you're stuck with it. So that is, definitely one option you can switch in and out. If you don't have a good Petrov backpack, as you see, mine only has that 5% weapon damage, and then 12,729 armor, and then 7,404 health, and then a measly 7% skill haste. Because things like the raid, you don't necessarily need the skill power. You just need a lot of damage to elites, and also a lot of all-over weapon damage. And you can kind of play with the numbers, but you don't want to stack completely all into damage to elites and then neglect the fact of those damage to elites is not really going to really be that effective if you have no weapon damage in itself. So I tried to get a mix of both worlds, 40k base damage on an LMG, then 70%, and then anything above that is just, icing on the cake, so to speak. But I try to hit around 80% damage to elites, and at 40k weapon damage, then you're good to go, and just as the kids these days would say, you're Gucci. But anyways, moving on, that's more or less the explanation of that. And then, of course, I'm running the 3-piece Yahl gear, starting with the chest piece. I have 12% total armor, 21,286 armor, and then 13.5% weapon damage. And then we are going with the only talent of Hardened. Now you could substitute Hardened here for additional damage to elites, and that would still put you around 300k armor. So you would still be plenty enough tanky as far as when it comes to raid things, because as long as you're around 300k armor, then you're good to go. Everything else is just extra and will just help further your survivability, but it's not necessarily necessary in order to actually participate and actually complete the raid. Most builds that you'll see from people that actually have completed the raid numerous times will tell you that around 300k armor is basically your cutoff to where your red line. You don't want to dip necessarily too far below 300k armor, such as like around the 270, 280s. So I mean, if you can get like 295 and up, then anything around that ballpark, you're good to go. But like I said, if you want hard hitting here, you still will achieve that 300k armor. You just adding additional damage to elites. Would a actual DPS talent here, would that be more viable? Could you do better? Well, let's say, for instance, Unstoppable Force, and of course you're in the raid, 8-man team group, and it's dependent and it's only procced once you get a kill. So if you get actually a kill, then it's going to be well worth it for all the extra DPS. But with so many other players that you're playing with in the raid, getting actually that last bullet of that kill and it is contingent upon that is kind of iffy, and I don't want to leave it up to chance. Well, I may get it, I may not. At least this way, with just having hardened or just going with straight up with hard hitting, then I know exactly what I'm dealing with. It's not contingent on anything. It's going to be the same from beginning to end. So it leaves nothing up to chance. So that's why I don't mind not having an actual active talent on my chest piece with the likes. Even Bloodsucker could work. Unbreakable, a lot of people go to just for the extra survivability. But for me, I like the Yahl gear, and hardened is just fine. And also it has 2 mod slots in the chest piece as well. One is a defensive mod slot at 56-55 armor, 445 armor regen, and then 2.5% total armor. And then we have an offensive mod, 1% weapon damage, 3% assault rifle damage, and then 4% LMG damage. And this mod works out really well because I'm using the LMG and an AR combo. So I get a little weapon damage going to both by having an offensive mod slot in my chest piece. Percent weapon damage. Now, if I want to go like I was talking about earlier, a more even power 50-50 with LMG damage and AR damage, then I could just switch to this Yahl gear piece, get a little bit more health. I lose just 1,000 in armor, but I go with more or less on the lines of AR damage. So that way the Eagle is up 1,000 more in damage, and then my LMG is still at 37.6. And if that's an option that you have, then by all means, just whatever your personal preference is. But since I'm mostly in like the first 3 phases of the raid, specifically run an LMG, so typically I run these gloves here. Now, in a perfect world, once I come across another piece, I don't necessarily need that utility Lego attribute, so I would rather have like my other pair and have actually a health value or some additional hazard protection. But I'm already getting 8% for at least having 2 pieces, and we have 3 pieces of Yahl gear, and that gives us the 10% weapon handling to further help us land shots even at mid-range when using an unhinged LMG. And then, like I stated, the additional 8% hazard protection, and then that 5% weapon damage. Now, the third and final piece is the Yahl gear mask. 2.5% health. I wish that value was a little higher. And then the damage to elites is at 36%. And then, of course, hard hitting 10% damage to elites for a total of 46%. And if you're able to get a higher roll and damage to elites, then by all means slap that puppy on there. But right now, that's all that I have as far as that 36% damage to elites. So if you have a higher value you can put on there, then that just means more damage output and make the build even more potent. And before I go any further, you're probably wondering, well, where do you get Yahl gear? Well, you can get it in the conflict proficiency caches, and then you can also get it in dark zone proficiency caches, and it drops in throughout the whole entire dark zone, whether it be normalized or occupied. Very few, but some say they hardly come across some Yahl gear pieces. But just today I was running in there for about an hour, and I probably got 5 or 6 to drop for me. So I mean, it's not completely a ghost town when it comes to actually farming the gear. Sometimes it can be like a ghost town when it comes to farming the players that you want to go in there and do. But you can find these pieces fairly easily, and you can be you won't be pestered as of right now if you're going to go try to farm the dark zone. Just be in a group, and no matter what you're running, I go in there with this particular PvE build just to farm a little bit, and I end up farming landmarks and players at the same time and getting a lot of gear. So that is where you can find it. We've already went over the Petrov backpack, but let's go on to the Heliegard holster, which have 42,748 health and then 371 skill power. And as always, as I state, I like the Heliegard holster. It is kind of like my go-to for holsters because it has 2 offensive mod slots. And these 2 offensive mod slots, I have 1% weapon damage, 4% assault rifle damage, and then 4% LMG damage. Once again, it's more like that 50-50. I'm getting 5% to my AR and 5% to my LMG. And then the second one, 1% weapon damage, 3% SMG damage, and then 5% LMG damage. So I do have some assault rifle ones that I get 5% LMG damage and then 1.5% for a total of 6.5%. And if I had those, then definitely I would be well over 40k weapon damage. Now on to the final piece. It is the Gila knee pads. It has 14,795 armor, and then of course hard hitting, an additional 10% damage to elites. Now this is what I typically run at first, but it depends on what role that I'm playing in the raid. So if I'm more like on an overwatched seated position to where I'm constantly firing from cover, then I could switch it up and go to the likes of a Fenris knee pads, which is, it does drop my armor, but as you can see, I'm still right around that 300k armor pool, and that just further helps me with my DPS and damage when it comes to my Eagle Bearer or an AR. So when instead of reloading, I can easily switch to it for more accurate and more longer mid-range to long-range shots. So it just depends on how you want to mix and match it, whether if you're proficient enough in the raid and know your position and then know what you can risk, whether you will help you out and you need actually patience in that situation, that position that you're in, or you can more or less know the raid enough to where you do not have to run patience. You can just simply run hard hitting, and then the likes of like this, for instance, the Healer Guard knee pads, so that way you have a little bit further increased survivability. I mean, it's not much, but once again, that's a 30k armor increase, so it does definitely come in handy and help out. So now let's go over the stat sheet. Starting with the military M60E4 first. As you can see, it is 39,786, so right on the precipice of 40k damage. 10% reload speed, negative 15 weapon handling. It would be higher, but of course we have the Healer Guard that gives us 10% weapon handling. 51 and 51.5% all weapon damage bonus, and then a total of 49%. And then of course when it comes to an assault rifle, 22% assault rifle damage, and then of course that 51.5% all weapon damage, for a total of 73.5% weapon damage altogether going to my assault rifle. So fairly mix and match. I can completely make it totally even if I wanted to, just by switching out those particular gloves like I showed you. But more or less moving on. Then as you can see, we have 79% damage to elites. If I had a higher damage to elites value on my mask, then I would be well over 80%. I'm missing out on at least 12 to 13% damage to elites on that particular mask. I think possibly 13. So additional 13, that would put me at 92%. And typically you can judge by your overall weapon damage and your damage output as far as how much damage to elites that'll you'll be comfortable with. My more or less baselines would be whatever weapon type I'm using, you should at least have 70% all weapon damage, combined as far as the all weapon damage bonus and the type of weapon that you're using. Both of those combined, you want to shoot for at least 70%. And then, as much damage to elites as possible, as long as you're meeting at least 70% all weapon damage combined. But as far as the baseline, also I would say bottom line when it comes to damage to elites, 70%, but it's also once again contingent on how much damage output, whatever type weapon that you're actually using. The more damage output of that weapon, then the little bit more you can lessen up on the damage to elites. So that way you don't have to go out there continuously grind for the absolute perfect pieces and perfect gear. A lot of people doesn't really specify any kind of baselines of stats or percentages of what you actually should shoot for when it comes to things like doing the raid. So 70% for both is a good baseline. Anything less than that, it would be kind of iffy, but anything above that on both stats, you're good to go. And then moving on to the 324,494 armor, 16,225 armor regen, 79,137 max health, 39,569 health regen, then 28% has protection, bleed, blind, burn, confuse, disrupt, shock, and poison, then it comes to skills, but like I said, we're not really using the skills, but yet you can use auxiliary batteries and things of that nature, and such as like your chem launcher or healing overall, if you want to consider it burst or not. It's quite up to you whether it actually is determined to be that way. But the way the skills are now, you can get a significant chunk of health really quick with the chem launcher now. So it's almost kind of be categorized as, you know, burst healing. But that's going to about sum it up. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Like I said, this is more like an updated version. There's a lot of that ask on, you know, social media, and then in my gaming community on Facebook, Revolution Gaming. They've asked me on Twitter as far as what am I running when it comes to heroic missions or the raid. You know, ever since, you know, I've experienced it, I've completed it multiple times. And if I've tweaked it any, or, you know, they pretty much asked me what's the baseline of those percentages of what I would use. So I would figure I'd make a quick video trying to explain it. Try not to I guess dilly-dally and just ramble on and on, but, you know, kind of get you my philosophy and my viewpoint on how I look at it and what I think is acceptable and the baseline of the values that I try to shoot for. And with my potato aim, if I can, you know, make it through with these values, then I'm pretty sure anybody out there in the Division universe can do the same and likewise. But thank you guys so much for tuning in. Appreciate all the love and support. We'll see you guys fudging later.